So picking up where we left off, at Howard, starting with Charles Hamilton Houston, there's now been this real generation of talented lawyers trained, and in the late 40s and the early 50s, Charles Hamilton Houston began to really hand over the reins of the legal challenges to Thurgood Marshall. And so in these next few cases, that transition really becomes complete, as we'll see in a few minutes. So the NAACP's legal strategy after World War II is really built around that decision we talked about before, the Gaines versus Canada decision. So take a second and try to remember the Gaines versus Canada decision. And since I can see you through the computer, just nod when you can remember it. This was the one from the University of Missouri, where Lloyd Gaines applied to the law school because there was no law school in the state of Missouri for African Americans. And they told him no. The case went to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court had told the University of Missouri and the state of Missouri they could either let him in or build him his own law school. The state of Missouri said they would let him in, but then, hopefully you remember, Lloyd Gaines disappeared. All right, so now here we are after World War II, and the NAACP begins working the same kinds of cases, coming from segregated states, focused on law schools, because there were no state law schools for black people. So you see, this doesn't even meet the kind of nonsense definition of equality under Plessy versus Ferguson. Remember where equal just meant existence? This doesn't even meet that standard. So in the state of Texas, the University of Texas had a law school, state funded, paid for by taxpayers, but there is no law school for African Americans. So Herman Sweatt applied to the University of Texas Law School. And the University of Texas told him no. With help from the NAACP, he sued in the federal courts, and the federal courts backed up the Supreme Court standard from Gaines versus Canada, and they told the state of Texas, you can either let Herman Sweatt in or build him his own law school. So the state of Texas built him his own law school. A law school for Herman Sweatt. Now the law school was a joke of a law school. It had only one faculty member with a law degree. The library had one shelf of books. It was the epitome of unequal. But should that be able to meet the standard of equal under Plessy versus Ferguson? It should, right? Because it exists. There's a law school for black people. So here, Sweatt and the NAACP were arguing that this newly created, obviously unequal law school did not meet the legal standards. That's the case of Sweatt versus Painter, as it worked its way to the Supreme Court. And as we'll see, the Supreme Court would be busy this term on questions related to segregation. All right, so here in this decision, the Supreme Court told the state of Texas that what they had done, building Sweatt, this obviously unequal law school, was not good enough. And here, they told the state of Texas that they had two choices. They could either let Herman Sweatt in to the University of Texas Law School, or they had to make the law school for him and other black people truly equal. And they laid out some specifications about the number of faculty with law degrees and the quality of the library. They basically said it would have to be substantively equal to the University of Texas's law school. So you see, this took things a step further. A state had tried to build an unequal law school and count it as equal, and the Supreme Court said no. So while this was playing out in the 1940s, ending with the court decision in 1950, right next door to Texas, in Oklahoma, a similar kind of drama was playing out, where Henry McLaurin, a black Oklahoman, applied to the University of Oklahoma Law School, and they initially told him no. Federal courts, just like in Texas, told Oklahoma then that they had two choices. They could either let him in or build him his own law school. So the University of Oklahoma went the opposite way of Texas. They let Henry McLaurin into the University of Oklahoma Law School. But then, as you can see, they separated him within the school. In classrooms like this, he was forced to sit behind a curtain so that the students didn't have to see him. He had a segregated table in the cafeteria. He had a segregated space in the library. So they let him in, but then treat him completely unequally within the school. And so the case of McLaurin versus Oklahoma was really about, well, is this good enough? Does this count as equal protection of the law? And the Supreme Court said, no. They told the state of Oklahoma, you can either treat Henry McLaurin like every other student in the law school, or you can build him his own law school that has to be equal to the University of Oklahoma's law school. So the state of Oklahoma decided to treat Henry McLaurin like other law students. And you may be wondering, wow, what's really changing at the Supreme Court? Well, these Supreme Court justices were appointed by the presidents of the 30s and 40s, FDR and Harry Truman, who, remember, were better for civil rights than the presidents before them. So after these victories, the NAACP now got more ambitious. They began to think that maybe they should stop trying to get separate made equal and try to say that separate but equal was unconstitutional. I'm going to say that again, because really that's what their strategy has been, right? Is to try to get separate made equal, so that they could have equal education, even though it might be separate. But now they began to think they should shift that strategy and go towards actually challenging separate but equal, arguing that the whole idea was really unconstitutional. And now they decided to shift from law schools to the public schools, to the state public schools of the South, which were so thoroughly segregated. The NAACP, under Thurgood Marshall's leadership, filed cases in about a half dozen different southern school districts. All of those cases then wound up together when they reached the Supreme Court. And one family's name was at the top of a series of families' names. That was the Browns. Of course, this case will be Brown versus Board of Education. The Browns lived in Topeka, Kansas. Not what most people think of when they think of segregated America. Topeka, Kansas. And although they lived right down the road from the white elementary school, their daughters had to walk all the way across town, including crossing a fairly dangerous railroad yard, in order to get to the inferior black school on the other side of the town. And that school was clearly, obviously, unequal, in the same way as those pictures we looked at before, right? Remember these? Libraries, classrooms, obviously unequal. But it's been acceptable ever since Plessy versus Ferguson, because equal has just meant existence. Thurgood Marshall led the arguments at the Supreme Court. And Thurgood Marshall argued, among many arguments, that segregation was hurting the United States in the Cold War. He said that segregation actually helped our communist enemies because they use it against us to say we're not really a free country. He also argued, with help from psychological experts, that segregation had damaging impacts on black children, which of course was part of the point of creating segregation from the white people who did it. The Supreme Court has 9 justices on it. And every time they issue a decision, there's a vote. 5-4, 6-3, 7-2. And always, it's best to get a 9-0 decision. Because that tells you that everybody on the court agrees. If you get a 5-4 decision, then it's possible that just 5-10 years later, when one justice dies and there's a new one, that decision could be easily overturned. So 9-0 is always what you want, if you could get it for your side. And at this point, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court was a Californian named Earl Warren. And Warren wanted the Supreme Court to issue a decision that would help end segregation. But he thought it was critical that that decision be 9-0 and not 5-4 or 6-3. And in order to make that happen, what happens behind the scenes that none of us ever see is that the Supreme Court justices have to negotiate the language of their decision so that they can agree to it. And so a group of justices might say, here's our decision, and 2 of them say, I can't agree to that, I'll have to vote against this. And then if they come back and alter the language, maybe you can bring those people around. Well, in the end, the Supreme Court produced a 9-0 decision in favor of the Browns and the NAACP. 9-0. It was 1954 now. And the Supreme Court said, in language that sounded clear, powerful, we conclude that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. And that is different from anything they've said before. In the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. So now, it would not be good enough for a southern state to say, oh, we're going to spend as much money on black children's education as we do on white children's. That wouldn't be good enough. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. What makes them unequal, they've now said, is the act of separating the schools. There's Thurgood Marshall and part of his legal team celebrating outside the Supreme Court. All around the country, people who cared about civil rights and justice celebrated. But if you read closer in the decision, you would have noticed that there was nowhere in the decision any guidance on how to implement what would clearly be a major change in society. The court said that they still had to work out those details, and they would issue a second kind of supplementary decision as soon as they could work out those details. So for now, there's nothing about making it happen. There's nothing, for example, that says, like theoretically they could have said, every school district must begin integrating next fall. There's nothing like that in there. So there's nothing at this point to make states obey. That will be known as the Brown 2 decision, and it'll come in just a few minutes.